This is Ken Forrester, Executive Director at Momenta. Welcome to our Digital Thread podcast, produced by, for, and about digital industry leaders. In this series of conversations, we capture insights from the best and brightest minds in digital industry. They're executives, entrepreneurs, advisors, and other thought leaders. What they have in common is, like our team at Momenta, they are deep industry operators. We hope you find these podcasts informative, and as always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Good day and welcome to episode 237 of Momenta Industrial Impact podcast. Today, we're pleased to welcome back Alistair Fulton, COO and VP of Ecosystem for Blues. Alistair last joined us for podcast 202 while General Manager of LoRa Wireless and Consumer Sensing for Semtech. As a reminder, he has over 20 years of experience building vertical solutions, tools, and platforms, and ecosystems in the Internet of Things and the Industrial Internet of Things. From early roles at O2 in the UK and Deloitte in New York to leading Microsoft's entry into the IoT platform and tool space with Azure IoT, and leading Hitachi's award-winning Lumada Industrial IoT platform, Alistair has been at the forefront of industrial IoT. With his leadership of Semtech's wireless IoT business and now his new role at Blues, he remains a recognized IoT thought leader, public speaker, and visionary. And with that, Alistair, welcome back to our Industrial Impact podcast.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be back again, as you said. It feels like a long time since you and I last spoke, but I guess it's not been so far.
Yeah, no, it does. And, it's a bit of a double pleasure because we've featured Blues early on in podcast 168 with Mobeen Khan in 2021. It does seem like it hasn't been that long. And of course, talked with you in podcast 202, which, by the way, was one of our top 10 podcasts for 2023. So perhaps you can catch us up on what's happened since our last discussion.
Sure. As you mentioned, I was with Semtech for a number of years, leading the IoT division, principally focusing on LoRa and kind of really expanding the adoption of LoRa as a technology. I left Semtech at the end of 2022, mostly to take a much-needed career break. I mean, as you mentioned, I've been in this space for a good number of years, and I realized one morning that if I was going to be driving my kids to school and cooking them dinner every night and reading them bedtime stories while they were still kids, I needed to actively do something about that. And I also, part of the thinking was my wife has an independent jewelry business, Whitespace. So, I kind of played the role of house dad, if you like, for a while, so she could focus on building that out. I also had kind of realized that purely focusing on LoRa and working within a very traditional semiconductor company like Semtech, there were better ways in which I could further my personal goal of making IoT something that's accessible to a vastly wider range of folks. And so that also informed my decision to part with the onset of the Sierra acquisition and focus for some time during the course of that year or so on some more personal projects around investment, some advisory work that I took on. I work as an advisor for a number of companies in the space. And it was nice to kind of have a look around and explore and see really what had been going on outside my direct sphere of visibility, if you like.
We could probably do a whole episode on what's happened at Semtech since you left. Suffice it to say, it has been a bit of a tumultuous time for the company, but I think they finally seem to have their bearings in direction, and it's good to see the first fruits of the Sierra Wireless acquisition coming out of there. So I think you made a move at the right time. And I think especially, making the move to Blues, I thought was quite interesting. So you joined them in December of 2023. What attracted you to the company?
Well, I've followed Blues for a number of years, and I've known Ray, our CEO, since my very earliest days at Microsoft. He was actually the first executive that I was sent to see to pitch the incubation initiative that I started, that kind of ultimately transpired into Azure IoT through multiple iterations and, the work of many smarter folks than myself. But he was the first kind of senior executive that I went and pitched, the concept to. He at the time was the chief software architect of Microsoft. He took over when Bill Gates kind of stepped back from that role to focus on the Gates Foundation. And it was one of those meetings where, if Ray says this is a good idea, things will happen. And if Ray says this is not a good idea, things will not happen. And luckily, he felt it was a good idea and things moved forward. But I've stayed in touch with him ever since. I mean, he was very inspirational to me in those early days. He had an enormous impact on Microsoft over what was a relatively short few years. But for Ray, Azure IoT would not have come into existence. And a lot of the way that Microsoft thinks about product today can be traced directly back to the work that Ray did internally to really drive a very fundamental change in approach. So there was that aspect to it. I honestly met with Ray several years ago and he explained to me what he was trying to do with Blues. And I have to be honest, I didn't think it was possible at the time to actually take such a radical approach to simplifying connectivity. But I'll talk about that in a wee bit. The other thing that kind of drew me to Blues was, as I said earlier, it came clear to me that we could make, a technology like LoRa, LoRaWAN, the shiniest tool in the toolbox. A lot of the work we did around LoRa was to abstract away some of the underlying complexity of the radio access technology to allow developers to focus on, the application they were trying to build, using very standard software abstraction techniques, honestly, but applied to a much smaller hardware footprint. It became clear to me that, one shiny tool in the toolbox is great, but the reality of IoT, specifically industrial IoT, has always been that you need multiple ways of connecting devices to deal with the myriad different circumstances you find yourself in industrial IoT. And simply having a great, LP-WAN solution in the form of LoRa didn't cut it. And again, I've spoken to you before about personally why I'm in this space, and I think I speak for a lot of others in this space as well, in that I see it as our moral responsibility as engineers to make these technologies widely available because they represent the single best chance of addressing the causes of human-driven climate change. And so personally, I felt the moral calling, if you like, to go broaden my work a little bit. And Blues has taken a really radical approach to making connectivity work for developers. Unlike, I would say, other players in the space, and there are many different edge solutions out there, Blues Ray started with a blank sheet of paper to design how things should work. Actually from a developer's perspective, how should these technologies work? How should they interact? How should my choices as a developer be facilitated by a solution rather than hindered by a solution? Rather than trying to honestly respin the failed models of the past, which is what you see in a lot of other edge solutions. If you're trying to force fit a cellular module modem business into a new image of the future, it's never going to work as well as actually starting the job from scratch and doing it properly. And the final thing I would say is really the people. I mean, Ray, I've talked about, he's a hugely inspirational figure in the space, but he's also assembled a team in Blues that combines a bunch of grey-haired folks like me that have veteran understanding of what's gone wrong, otherwise known as we've made most of the mistakes ourselves and hopefully learned from them, with a team of really highly talented, young, brilliant minds in the software space. And, we're a small company. We're 50 strong at the moment. We've gone through Series A, we're well funded and we're on that kind of curve towards hyperscale growth. And it's an incredibly energetic, inspiring environment to be in, frankly.
Certainly sounds like it. So I was interested to use the term kind of edge IoT platforms. And of course, that, that can be a big range from, more consumer to prosumer to, of course, industrial, which we like to focus on. You mentioned, when you talked about kind of the why Blues aspect, you mentioned really the fit for purpose, I guess is the way I would describe it in terms of the design and the implementation. Maybe you could put industrial flavor on that. Help me understand why I would utilize Blues, especially in an industrial setting, right? Or more mission critical applications, right?
Sure. And a lot of it comes back to, I kick myself every time I use the word platform, because I think if you look at the technologies we're talking about today, the core things that we're trying to achieve have not changed in 20 years. We're essentially still trying to generate data from devices, ingest that data, analyze it. We went off as an industry, down this tangential path of building a separate island, IoT platforms that were somehow different, special from core OT systems, which they purported to support. I think that whole kind of diversion really led to a great deal of confusion. I think partly it was driven by engineers like myself wanting to build the shiny new thing. It was also driven by companies looking for new ways to monetize old streams of data. And I think what it drove was a massive explosion in complexity in this space that didn't help customers, get to the end result. So I think this whole notion of IoT as a separate world, separate thing failed ultimately. And I think what you see happening now with solutions that are more focused on the industrial edge is really a recognition that the systems that we're talking about really are just an extension of the enterprise core. Whereas in the past, IT departments could manage, the connected assets within their environment using relatively traditional tools, and those assets looked like computers or were hardwired PLCs and those sorts of devices. That kind of universe of devices is really expanding very rapidly to support demand for more analytics, more data, more insight, and ultimately a greater ability to optimize the functioning of very complex industrial systems. So when I talk about kind of the managed IoT edge or enterprise edge, it's really that. It's providing tools that allow customers to connect, devices that were previously unconnected, but to do so in a way that doesn't sacrifice flexibility, it doesn't sacrifice security, it doesn't sacrifice scalability in any way. And that's really what Blues has focused on. How do we make it as simple as can possibly be for a developer to connect a device and to do so in a way that is extraordinarily secure, highly scalable, highly manageable, without having to go down, the rat hole of learning what are typically custom, usually highly complex development techniques to work with different technologies. What Blues has done is take all of that complexity from different cellular technologies, satellite, LoRa, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, etc., and hide it effectively behind a JSON API, so that you as a developer, provided that you can communicate in JSON, which most developers these days can, you can instruct the device to do what you want it to do, and it does it, as opposed to having to tear back the covers and really get inside the technology and make a significant investment of time and effort into building a specific radio access technology into your device. I think that's particularly important in the case of cellular, because I talk to customers daily, I would say in the US, who have been through the sunsetting of networks. And if anything was cancerous for industrial IoT, it's the sunsetting of cellular networks, which happens on a fairly regular cycle, 5-6 years. In an industrial environment, you're looking at 15 to 20 years in a minimum lifespan for an asset very often. It's just completely, thrown a spanner into that process. So Blues has really taken all of that complexity, like I said earlier, sat down and thought in the early days, well, how should this actually work? Not how should it actually work? And produced a platform that is the simplest I've seen in all the years that I've been in this space.
Man, I'm glad I asked the question. I think you really brought out some very strong points there. Resilience overall, security, and then you started to talk about the analytics insights, and we'll talk in a few minutes about the impact of AI. I think when we talked with Moveen back in 2021, he used the term industrial data pump, which I thought was an interesting term at the time. And I think it's as applicable now when you think about how much edge AI we're trying to do, right? Literally pattern recognition at the edge. We have an investment in Edge Impulses, providing some software to do that. But ultimately being able to do a lot of the processing you would normally want to do in the cloud at the edge for resilience, for data latency reasons, for security reasons, right? All the above. So yeah, cool. So look, let's put a point on that. I'd like to understand some of the notable wins that you've had at Blues to really get a sense of how you guys are really working with your clients to make them successful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we see Blues kind of used, it's all of the use cases you would expect in industrial IoT, frankly. There are some, I would say, quite powerful use cases around things like emergency vehicle tracking is one of our customers. They produce a solution that enables operators to track the whereabouts of emergency vehicles, fire engines, ambulances, police cars, tow trucks, that sort of thing, to optimize drive routes, to facilitate communication with other vehicles, by integrating with other vehicle management systems so that on your dashboard, you get an alert that there's an ambulance coming up behind you, move out the way. Facilitating communication with dispatch to ensure that vehicles are getting to where they're needed as quickly as possible, with traffic lights, with lane assist. This customer in particular had built this solution with the 3G, based on 3G, got it up and running, but enough to prove the value, only to see 3G sunset impact their ability to continue to offer the service. And they also honestly had a subscription model with a cellular operator that they just hated. I mean, it created operational costs for them that was difficult for them to deal with. Whereas Blues, obviously, there is no subscription. The hardware cost includes 10 years of connectivity. And the thing that really appealed to them was the simplicity of development, simplicity of operation. And that's something that they're in the process of rolling out. We have a customer who focuses on industrial refrigeration. When you walk into your local Target or Costco, Walmart, what have you, you see these massive, great big banks of coolers, which not only do they consume a significant amount of power, but the quality of the produce in those refrigeration units is dependent upon how well those refrigeration units are performing. Again, in the past, this has been something that's been quite a customized solution for most customers. Often, significant cost falling on the operator, the retailer, implement these solutions. And what this customer has done is take Blues to build a very simple connectivity solution that facilitates both kind of centralized processing of data, but also localized processing of data to tell what's happening in the refrigerator now. Another customer is an aftermarket lift monitoring company, and they produce a solution that targets the 16 million elevators that exist worldwide, that you can stick on top of the elevator, that uses machine learning to detect degradation in the elevator's performance and alert you to go fix it before it breaks down the shaft and strands someone. It's these sorts of things. Those are the real kind of meat and drink classic industrial IoT use cases, which are all about saving the consumption of energy, saving the wastage of product, saving pollution, saving resource, really fundamentally contributing to the bottom line of those businesses. We also see other, I would say more exotic solutions. I mean, one that, constantly amazed by is a customer who uses Blues to connect ocean buoys. And these ocean buoys measure the current and water temperature. They literally drop them in the ocean and they kind of float around and gather data. And they use that data at an aggregate level to enable global shipping companies to optimize routes, to reduce fuel consumption. So you can get a cargo ship from A to B with 20-30% less fuel if you make the right decisions about routing. And those, again, they're classic industrial IoT use cases in that they are fundamentally about contributing to the bottom line, but they also represent, I think, an extension of these technologies to use cases that 15, 20 years ago would have been very, very difficult to enable. And there are a bunch of others like that. One of our more recent ones is demand response switch for a company that provides electricity grid management. And that's connecting these devices so that you can actually actively switch off supply during peak load periods, because particularly as we come into the summer months in the US, the strain on what's very often quite elderly core electrical grid infrastructure starts to get very difficult to manage. And whilst the principle of being able to flex supply with industrial customers and to compensate them financially for that is a great one in principle, in practice it's been very difficult to deliver in, again, a highly secure, highly scalable, easy to manage way. And so this customer is using Blues to do exactly that. They built a prototype using Blues in 2 weeks. They had spent 2 years prior to that trying to build a solution with legacy technologies, and they'd given up because it was too expensive. And so that's really those marginal use cases where pain and expense served as a significant dissuader for customers who could otherwise potentially generate quite a significant financial and environmental outcome. Blues is targeting that pain and frustration, delivering an easier way to get to the prize. And we see customers every day, taking advantage of that and implementing projects that perhaps, again, 3 or 4 years ago, they would put it on the back burner and say, well, great, one day when we've got the time and the money, those projects can come to life today with Blues.
These are all great examples of industrial impact. And going back to one of the things you said early on, very much aligned with, I know, the ideals you live your life by in terms of the impact you want to have. And we have begun to see more and more emission or global greenhouse gases tracking, call it scope 3, if you will, emissions in terms of upstream requirements now coming, and enough so that we begin to see whether the real killer use case of a lot of industrial IoT is going to be that scope 3 style emission tracking all the way down, and of course related to the products. One of our companies is SmartX, and they do textiles, and we spent some time with them in Portugal recently, literally walking the whole textile value chain and the members there. And you get a sense for the potential impact you could have, literally to the point where someday the QR code on your T-shirt does tell you everybody in the value chain and the provenance and the materials and such. So I think there's a bigger world that you are probably just scratching the surface on in some of your examples there that you guys will be well prepped for.
Well, I think I've always thought of IoT as really, this is the way that you align economic goals and environmental goals. Every industrial company wants to make more from less. They want to be more efficient because it means that they can be more profitable. And given the information that you can generate from IoT systems and the insights that you can generate from analyzing that information, that's how you align the goal of producing more from less from an economic perspective with the goal of producing more from an environmental perspective. And that's why I said earlier, I really do see IoT as our best shot at really addressing the causes of human-driven climate change.
Well said. So you mentioned earlier enterprise, and I'll use the term manage. I think you might have even used in there. One of the challenges with any edge deployment that I've seen in IT, but especially in OT, is, especially if you're looking across heterogeneous hardware and software you have at the edges, that how do you manage that in an enterprise setting, especially when you talk about, kind of remote data points that are out there in facilities. So what is the role of managed enterprise edge in enabling IoT? And specifically, how does Blues help solve that?
As soon as you start talking about industrial IoT, if you're talking about real, value, you're talking about mission critical systems or semi-mission critical systems. And with the recent CrowdStrike situation, just barely in the rearview mirror, in those sorts of environments, there are a few fundamental things that you have to be able to do. You have to be able to guarantee the security of a connected device. Even if that device is ring-fenced, doesn't connect to the internet, which is how Blue's devices work. They're cellularly enabled, but they don't touch the public internet. They use VPN to communicate to the backend. Even when you've implemented, a secure, by design approach, which is what Blue's does, you still want to have confidence that the data flowing from those devices is encrypted at the point of origin in a way that only you can access. You also need to be able to patch those devices, to update the software running on those devices, to be able to reach those devices and download an entirely new version of the firmware if necessary. And that requires over-the-air update, and it requires the ability to do that in a way that's designed for enterprise, which is not onesie, twosies, and you can update 10 here and 10 there. It means being able to write business rules about how you want to manage the software that's running on your fleet of devices based on whatever principle you want to apply, whether it's based on location, whether it's based on version of firmware, etc. These are all basic principles. And for non-IP based devices particularly, it's been very hard to apply those principles over the years. And as a result, a lot of companies, for a long time, IT was made the bad boy in IoT. You've got to work around IT. You can't work within the IT infrastructure. Well, that's proven to be wrong. I think the reason that your IT manager was raising concern about the way that you were connecting devices in the past, those were valid reasons. And I think that today, when I talk about the managed enterprise edge, it's really a recognition that it is essential to extend those same principles that you would apply to a laptop connecting to your network to the PLC that's running in one of your factories that you're connecting wirelessly. And if you don't do that, then all you're doing is introducing vulnerability or cost in the form of difficulty of managing these different disparate solutions. You've got to be able to look at the devices, diverse though they are, both in type and location and data form and IP capability. You've got to look at them as a homogeneous whole and regard them as part of your entire enterprise environment that just happens to sit on the edge.
You can't go too far these days in any IT or OT application without talking about the impact of AI and all its different forms. How are you guys helping your clients achieve their AI goals in terms of their edge deployments?
Well, today, the focus has been very much in this first part of kind of Blue's period, history, if you like, on enablement. So get the device connected so that you can collect the data that it's capable of generating and you can analyze it accordingly. As we go forward, starting to use, AI and ML, it runs the risk of being the latest kind of fad, and we will inevitably end up in a period of disappointment when people realize that this isn't necessarily the magical cure that solves everything. That said, the ability to automate the analysis of data and automate the extraction of insight that AI in particular represents, machine learning also, I think is really key to being able to intelligently manage fleets of devices. So this is something we're very actively looking at. How can you use these new techniques both to understand better what's going on within the 100,000 devices that you have connected? How can you use those tools to better anticipate what is going to happen and infer at the edge what the most likely outcome of any given situation is, and thereby replace the need for perhaps sending data or increase the speed with which you can respond to a situation based on the track record of events leading up to that point in time? Those are very interesting areas for us, as well as using AI, like I said, to manage devices. Essentially, I want my device fleet to be self-healing. I want to be able to anticipate issues. I want to be able to anticipate the need to update software or business rules. And I want to be able to write simple rules that can then be interpolated and applied using intelligence based on AI. I think that's kind of the next wave of industrial IoT. In many respects, the bit that's kind of held back, I think, the adoption of IoT, we've talked about the complexity that, we as an industry created. But over the last, I'd say, 10 years, it used to be the case that it was difficult to know what to do with the data. That's no longer the case. There are many tools now enhanced by AI and ML that are very powerful in terms of being able to interpret what's happening. A lot of the issue today is still, after all this time, just basic connectivity. How do I actually, in a cost-effective, secure, scalable way, connect everything? That's the problem that we have focused on nailing at this point. I think we've nailed it. I think we're seeing the uptake that stems from that. The next set of opportunities, I think, is how do we use some of these new tools and techniques to introduce more automated intelligence into the way that those managed enterprise edge environments operate?
The focus on connectivity is certainly a valid one. I was in a forum several weeks ago talking about greenhouse gas emissions tracking and such. It was called the Point Zero Forum and a panel discussion. And one of the stats I mentioned, which is one we've talked about quite often, is that 85% of industrial assets are still dark. And, it's interesting for a I'll call it OT crowd to realize how challenging of environment it really is when that many industrial assets are not able to communicate or have sensors on them and, or be remotely controlled. So I think that is still the tough nut to crack, is simply just the connectivity of these things, right? And then building up, as you said, additional layers of value on top of that. So I think your focus is exactly right in that regard. Look, as we wrap up, I'm curious how you maintain your edge as a leader. Any recommendations you'd like to highlight for the audience?
I know that we've talked about this before, I think, on the prior podcast. Number one, I would say, always assume that you're wrong. I think we very easily fall into a trap of believing our own bullshit in all technology spaces, frankly. And I would say throughout the course of my career, I've really tried to focus on assuming that, whatever the plan is, whatever the idea is, it's probably wrong. You just don't know how it's wrong. And the first focus is on figuring out what's wrong with it and how to fix it. The surest way to do that is to talk to customers. Again, I think we tend to, as engineers, exist in our own echo chambers, and it's very easy to start believing that our vision of the future is one that is shared by others. It is a humbling experience to go out there and talk to people who are dealing with real world problems. If you just read the trade press and listen to the news, you would be right to assume it have been solved years ago, connectivity being principal amongst them. But when you talk to customers and they explain to you just how difficult it is to connect to a sensor in a hot rolling steel mill. That's humbling. So that's number one, I would say. Talk to customers. They will tell you how you are wrong, and they will help you figure out what to do about it. I take advantage of quite a lot of podcasts. It's hard these days to actually figure out, of the massive variety of material out there, which one's worth listening to. But there are several. I like Diary of a CEO with Stephen Bartlett. There's a great podcast called TWIML, which stands for This Week in Machine Learning, with a guy called Sam Charrington. That's also very insightful, quite deep technically. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years learning about AI and ML and trying to discern truth from fiction. And then there are a few, we're at this point in my career somewhat by reverse. I'm now working in a very small startup environment. And so there are a number of really useful podcasts, like Guy Raz has a podcast called How I Built This, a Startup School with Seth Godin. And then I would also include things like WTF with Mark Maron that will keep you grounded in the world, even though it has nothing to do with technology. And the other thing I do, it's the people I work with, honestly, that help me maintain, as you said, my edge, such as that is. It's making sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who think differently from you, who have different ideas, different ways of seeing things, and different experiences. Diversity of thought is something, again, that in many technology spaces that I've been in has been sadly lacking. But it's only through having a good, diverse view of the world from multiple different viewpoints that you can, I think, figure out what the right path is and figure out why you're wrong, again, more quickly. So things like that, I would say. And just, never assume that you know the answer. I think the day that we stop learning is the day that we should give up and go off and play golf for the rest of our lives. There's never a day where there is an opportunity to learn something that you didn't understand before, provided that you keep your eyes and mind open.
Great insights, Alistair. Always well said. So thank you for once again sharing your time and these wonderful insights with us today.
Indeed. Well, thank you for having me. I look forward to the next one. I'll try and work out. So 2 years' time now, maybe sooner, but it's always a pleasure talking to you, Ken.
As well. So this has been Alistair Fulton, COO and VP of Ecosystem for Blues. Thank you for listening, and please join us for the next episode of our Industrial Impact Podcast. We wish you an impactful day. You've been listening to the Momenta Digital Thread podcast series. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and as always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please check our website at momenta.one for archived versions of podcasts, as well as resources to help with your digital industry journey. Thank you for listening.